He can't play at all. And when Graham Souness said those words, you knew there was real venom behind them. Souness never did things by halves, and his ability to hold a grudge against players he hated became legendary in football. Throughout his career as both a player and manager, there were 5 men who truly got under his skin, and the stories of these feuds reveal a darker side to one of Britain's most celebrated footballers. Before we dive into the chaos, it's worth remembering that Souness was an exceptional talent. As a player, he won 5 league titles and 3 European Cups with Liverpool, captaining one of the greatest sides English football has ever seen. But success came with an edge that would later define his managerial career in all the wrong ways. The first grudge began at Liverpool itself, with a man who should have been his ally. In 1981, manager Bob Paisley made a decision that would spark decades of hatred. He stripped Phil Thompson of the captaincy and handed the armband to Souness instead. Thompson felt robbed, believing Souness had stolen something that rightfully belonged to him. What started as professional resentment quickly became personal. Thompson made deeply hurtful remarks about Souness's first wife, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The 2 men came to loathe each other with an intensity that time only seemed to strengthen. Years later, when Souness returned to Liverpool as manager, he finally got his revenge. He sacked Thompson from the coaching staff, settling a score that had been brewing for over a decade. It was cold, calculated, and absolutely deliberate. But Thompson wasn't alone in feeling the force of Souness's uncompromising nature. As a manager at Rangers between 1986 and 1991, Souness himself later admitted he bordered on being out of order, describing his own behaviour as obnoxious and difficult to deal with. This wasn't false modesty. Souness had built his playing reputation on physical dominance. During the 1984 European Cup semi-final, he openly bragged about delivering what he called the best punch of his life, breaking an opponent's jaw. That willingness to use violence didn't disappear when he swapped his boots for a suit and clipboard. If anything, it became the foundation of his managerial philosophy. Before we move on, take a second to subscribe and hit that bell icon. What do you think makes a good manager? Fear or respect? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this story is about to get even more intense. By the time Souness moved to Blackburn Rovers, his methods had been tested across multiple clubs, and cracks were beginning to show. At Blackburn, he enjoyed genuine success, winning promotion and the League Cup in 2002. He worked effectively with talented young players like Damien Duff and David Dunn, and he brought in experienced strikers like Andy Cole. But beneath the silverware, there was constant friction. Souness fell out with a long list of players, and one conflict in particular exposed just how far his confrontational style had gone. Andrew Cole, the prolific striker, found himself in an increasingly toxic relationship with his manager. Cole believed he was being singled out for unfair treatment. He was denied days off, missed a team flight to Spain, and felt victimized at every turn. The dispute became so serious that the Professional Footballers Association had to step in to mediate. This wasn't just about a manager and a player having a disagreement. It was about employment rights, contractual fairness, and a complete breakdown in trust. The fact that a union had to intervene showed that Souness's hardline approach was no longer just tough. It was potentially unlawful. His methods were incompatible with the modern game's rising standards of professionalism and accountability. Souness's handling of David Dunn at Blackburn revealed another side to his ruthlessness. Dunn was publicly criticised for his attitude, with Souness questioning his commitment in training and citing daft injuries. The manager placed him on the transfer list, but later admitted this was a carefully calculated move, designed to provoke a reaction. Souness openly said he didn't care if Dunn pulled faces behind his back or called him names, as long as the player performed on the pitch. He was willing to sacrifice any positive relationship for short-term results. Respect, in Souness's world, came from fear and pressure, not mutual trust. But it was at Newcastle United where Souness's managerial approach truly imploded. Appointed in September 2004 to replace the beloved Sir Bobby Robson, Souness was brought in to restore discipline. Instead, his 18-month tenure became a masterclass in how not to manage a football club. Commentators widely agree that Souness completely destroyed the good atmosphere Robson had created, setting Newcastle on a path towards years of chaos and underachievement. One of Souness's earliest disciplinary challenges at Newcastle involved Kieran Dyer. Just days into the job, Dyer was caught on CCTV urinating in an alleyway and had to attend a police station to receive a caution. Souness drove him home afterwards, and instead of issuing a standard fine or warning, he bypassed all normal procedures. In the car, Souness turned to Dyer and delivered a chilling threat. "If you ever do anything like this again, I will bin you," he said. Then he added, "If I ever have to come to a police station again, I will beat you up." Dyer later confirmed he kept his mouth shut because he knew Souness wasn't messing around. This wasn't just tough management, it was a manager threatening physical violence to control a player's behaviour. The most explosive confrontation of Souness's career came with Welsh striker Craig Bellamy. During a match against Charlton, Souness substituted Bellamy, and television cameras caught the striker muttering a crude insult in the manager's direction as he walked off. When Souness saw the footage, he was furious. The next morning, he called a squad meeting and publicly humiliated Bellamy in front of his teammates, referring to him with a vulgar insult. Then Souness grabbed Bellamy by the throat. He challenged the player to a physical fight, demanding they sort it out like men in the gym. Only the intervention of Captain Alan Shearer, who physically restrained Souness, prevented an all-out brawl. Chairman Freddie Shepherd immediately instructed agents to engineer Bellamy's exit, confirming the player had played his last game for Newcastle. The incident was a public relations disaster and a damning indictment of Souness's inability to manage conflict without resorting to violence. The chaos Souness cultivated reached its peak in April 2005 during a match against Aston Villa. Newcastle were already losing 3-0 when teammates Lee Bowyer and Kieran Dyer started fighting each other on the pitch. Both were sent off, leaving Newcastle to finish the match with 9 men. It was a global embarrassment, broadcast live to millions. In the dressing room afterwards, Souness was described as flint-faced and traumatic. His response to this ultimate public display of indiscipline was to offer to fight both Bowyer and Dyer simultaneously. Bowyer received a 7-game ban from the FA, a £30,000 fine, and a club fine of 6 weeks' wages, estimated at around £200,000. Souness's final act of challenging his own players to a fight underscored just how dysfunctional his management had become. Souness inherited a Newcastle side that had been challenging for the Champions League under Robson. Despite spending close to £50 million on new players during his reign, he was unable to stabilise the team. The constant internal conflict alienated key talents like Bellamy and Cole, turning what had been a vibrant squad into a struggling mid-table side. By February 2006, with Newcastle sitting 15th in the Premier League table, Souness was sacked. It was a spectacular failure that confirmed one harsh truth: massive financial investment cannot overcome a toxic internal culture driven by extreme man management methods. Since leaving Newcastle, Souness has repeatedly described the job as horrible and the worst of his career. He blamed the difficulties on having to answer to people upstairs who, in his view, should have been below him. But the evidence tells a different story. Souness created the chaos himself. His reliance on physical threats with Dyer and Bellamy, and his legally questionable disciplinary actions with Cole that required union intervention, forced the club hierarchy to constantly intervene. He cultivated the toxic environment that made his job unbearable, then blamed everyone else for the consequences. The inflexibility and confrontation that defined his playing days proved utterly incompatible with modern football management. Looking back at these 5 feuds, with Phil Thompson, Andrew Cole, Kieran Dyer, Craig Bellamy, and Lee Bowyer and Dyer together, a clear pattern emerges. Souness managed through fear and dominance, with zero tolerance for perceived disrespect. His responses ranged from calculated psychological pressure with Dunn to institutional action with Cole and Thompson, and outright physical threats with Dyer and Bellamy. While this approach may have worked in the less scrutinized environments of the past, it proved disastrous in the modern, high-profile world of Premier League football. Today, Souness is a television pundit known for his strong and controversial opinions. In many ways, his media persona is a direct continuation of the divisive figure he was in the dressing room. His failure at Newcastle United serves as a powerful cautionary tale, demonstrating that managerial inflexibility and a reliance on the hard man mentality were completely at odds with sustained success in contemporary professional football. Despite all the chaos and controversy, Souness remains a football legend whose playing achievements can never be taken away. His 5 league titles and 3 European Cups speak to a brilliance that was undeniable. But his managerial legacy tells a different story, one of grudges held too long, conflicts escalated too far, and a refusal to adapt that ultimately cost him the respect he so desperately sought to command through fear. Brian McClair had a career full of trophies and success, but beneath all that glory was something darker. One player hated him so much that years later he still spoke about their feud with real anger. McClair won league titles, cups, and individual awards, but he also made enemies everywhere he went. This was not just about football rivalries. This was about a man who refused to fit in, who studied mathematics while playing professionally, and who wrote revealing stories about his teammates. His nickname was Chocky, a playful name that came from chocolate eclair, but there was nothing sweet about the battles he fought throughout his career. 4 people in particular clashed with McClair in ways that defined his entire professional life. And these conflicts were not accidents. They were the result of a footballer who thought differently and challenged everyone around him. McClair started his career at Aston Villa in 1980 as a young player full of potential. English football back then demanded complete dedication from young players. You were expected to eat, sleep, and breathe football with no distractions. But McClair was different. He applied to study mathematics at the University of Glasgow because he wanted a backup plan in case football did not work out. To him, this was sensible thinking. To his manager Ron Saunders, this was betrayal. Saunders had just won the league title with Villa, and he had no patience for players who looked beyond football. When Saunders found out about the university application, he called McClair into his office, and the conversation was brief and brutal. Saunders told him that if he wanted to go to university, he could leave the club immediately. The exact words were harsh and left no room for discussion. McClair was kicked out of Aston Villa just for applying to study. This was the first major conflict of his career, and it taught him that football did not respect intellectual ambition. But here is what made McClair special. After leaving Villa, he joined Motherwell in 1981 and actually did both. He played professional football while studying mathematics at the University of Glasgow. He proved that he could succeed in both areas. In 1983, Celtic signed him, and he decided to focus fully on football. His time at Celtic brought him the Scottish Cup in 1985 and the Scottish League in 1986. In 1987, he scored 35 goals and won both the Scottish Football Writers' Player of the Year and the Scottish Players' Player of the Year awards. He had proven Ron Saunders completely wrong. Now, before we continue with the rest of his story, think about this for a second. Have you ever been told you could not do 2 things at once? That you had to choose one path and forget everything else? Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when someone doubted your ability to balance different parts of your life. And if you are enjoying this story so far, hit that subscribe button because we have 3 more explosive conflicts to cover. During his successful years at Celtic, McClair developed another enemy. But this one was not a person, it was the entire Scottish officiating system. McClair publicly blamed referees for costing Celtic 2 League Cup finals. He was not just complaining like a regular fan, he gave specific details about what went wrong. In the 1984 League Cup final, Celtic lost to Rangers, who won the match with a score of 3-2. McClair claimed that Rangers were given 2 soft penalties that should never have been awarded. 2 years later, in 1986, Celtic lost another League Cup final, and McClare blamed this one on a bad referee and poor linesman. He said the officials caused Celtic to lose control of the match, which led to 2 Celtic players being sent off. McClare called these results an injustice and said that players like his teammate Shepherd lost out on trophies they deserved. He even asked who would compensate these players for what was taken from them. This was not just anger talking. This was McClare using his analytical mind to criticise a system he thought was broken. His complaints about Scottish referees stayed with him for decades. Even in recent discussions about video assistant referee technology, McClare brought up those old matches to prove that bad officiating had always been a problem in Scottish football. What makes this conflict interesting is what happened years later. In 2015, McClare was appointed as the National Performance Director of the Scottish FA, the same organisation that oversaw the referees he had criticised for so long. The critic became part of the system. However, his time in that role only lasted 1 year. He left in July 2016. This short period suggests that changing football from the inside was harder than criticising it from the outside. But the most personal and violent conflict of his career was still to come. When McClare moved to Manchester United in 1987, he entered one of the most intense rivalries in English football. Manchester United versus Arsenal was already a fierce competition, but McClare made it personal, with one Arsenal player in particular. Nigel Winterburn was a fullback for Arsenal, and in 1988, these 2 men became enemies. It happened during an FA Cup match that Arsenal won with a score of 2-1. In the final moments of the game, McClare stepped up to take a penalty that could have earned United a replay. He missed. Arsenal won, and Nigel Winterburn decided to mock him publicly. Winterburn taunted McClare right there on the pitch, making fun of his failure in front of everyone. This humiliation stuck with McClare and his teammates. They did not forget. 2 years passed. McClare waited. Then, on the 20th of October 1990, Manchester United played Arsenal at Old Trafford. The referee was Keith Hackett. During the match, Winterburn made a bad tackle on United fullback Dennis Irwin. Irwin reacted by kicking out at Winterburn, but McClare saw his chance. He immediately joined in and also kicked Winterburn. This was not about defending his teammate. This was revenge for what happened 2 years earlier. The situation exploded into chaos, and as Limpar, a Swedish player for Arsenal, appeared to punch McClare. Within seconds, every player on the pitch, except Arsenal goalkeeper David Seaman, was involved in fighting. This was a 21-man brawl, one of the biggest fights in English football history. Referee Keith Hackett let the players continue and only gave yellow cards to Winterburn and Limpar during the match. The Football Association had to step in after the match because the violence was so serious. Both clubs were fined £50,000 each, a huge amount of money back then. But the punishment went further. The FA did something very rare in English top-flight football. They deducted points from both teams. Manchester United lost 1 point. Arsenal lost 2 points because they had also been involved in a previous fight with Norwich City. The fact that McClare waited 2 full years to get his revenge shows how deep this hatred ran. He did not forget what Winterburn did to him, and when the opportunity came, he took it. This was not just a rivalry between clubs. This was personal, and it became one of the defining moments of the Manchester United versus Arsenal feud. The fourth and final major conflict in his career was with the most important person at Manchester United. Sir Alex Ferguson was the manager who built United into one of the greatest clubs in the world, and McClare played a big part in those early successful years. But their relationship was complicated. Ferguson was famous for something called the hairdryer treatment. This was when he would scream at players who made mistakes, getting so close to their faces that it felt like a hairdryer blowing hot air at them. McClare received this treatment multiple times, sometimes for mistakes he made years earlier. Ferguson never forgot errors, and he made sure his players knew it. The main problem between McClare and Ferguson was that McClare refused to keep quiet about what happened inside the team. He wrote columns for the official Manchester United Club magazine, where he told revealing stories about the dressing room. Later, he published a book called Odd Man Out, which was released in 1997 and updated in 1998. This was his personal diary from his time as a player. In an environment where Ferguson controlled everything and demanded total loyalty, a player writing openly about internal team matters was a direct challenge to the manager's authority. Ferguson built his success on keeping everything private and maintaining complete control over his squad. But here is the interesting part. Ferguson tolerated this from McClair in a way that Ron Saunders never would have. Saunders kicked McClair out immediately for just applying to university. Ferguson, despite being angry about the writing and despite giving McClair the hairdryer treatment many times, recognised something valuable in him. Ferguson understood that McClair's intelligence and independent thinking made him useful, even if it was occasionally inconvenient. The proof of their strong relationship came after McClair retired as a player. In 1999, Ferguson brought him back to Old Trafford as a youth team coach. Then, from 2006 to 2015, McClair served as Youth Academy Director, overseeing 150 children aged 9 to 18. He worked with important staff members like Paul McGuinness and helped continue United's tradition of developing young talent. This role showed that despite their conflicts, Ferguson trusted McClair completely. McClair spent nearly a decade in one of the most important positions at the club, shaping the next generation of Manchester United players. The relationship between these two men was never simple or easy, but it was built on mutual respect. Ferguson saw past the intellectual challenges and the public writing because he valued what McClair brought to the team. Unlike Saunders, who only saw disloyalty, Ferguson saw potential. So what do all these conflicts tell us about Brian McClair? They show us a man who never fit the traditional mold of a footballer. He studied mathematics while playing professionally. He publicly criticised the Scottish football establishment for years. He held a personal grudge for 2 years before violently settling the score. He challenged his manager's authority by writing openly about team secrets. Every single conflict came from the same source: his refusal to just be a footballer and nothing else. He wanted to think, to analyse, to question, and to express himself. Football in the 1980s and 1990s did not always welcome that kind of independence, but McClair succeeded anyway. He won 4 Premier League titles and 2 FA Cups with Manchester United. He won the Scottish League and Scottish Cup with Celtic. He was named Player of the Year in Scotland. He later became a Youth Academy Director and even worked as National Performance Director for the Scottish FA, trying to fix the very system he had criticised. His career proves that you can challenge authority, make enemies, and still achieve great things if you stay true to who you are. The story of Brian McClair is not just about football, it is about a person who refused to be put in a box, who fought against people and systems that tried to limit him, and who proved that being different can be a strength. From the philosophical battle with Ron Saunders to the institutional fight with Scottish referees, from the physical war with Nigel Winterburn to the hierarchical dance with Sir Alex Ferguson, McClair navigated every conflict with the same stubborn intelligence that made him special. Now here is a question for you. Which of these 4 conflicts do you think defined Brian McClair the most? Was it the early rejection from Ron Saunders that set him on his path? The long-running criticism of Scottish officials that showed his principles? The explosive revenge against Nigel Winterburn that revealed his competitive fire? Or the complicated relationship with Sir Alex Ferguson that proved he could work within the system while still being himself? Drop your answer in the comments below and let us know what you think. And if this story showed you a side of football history you had never seen before, make sure you are subscribed because we have plenty more stories like this coming your way. He can't play at all. When Alan Clark publicly said those words about his own players in 1990, it marked the end of a 12-year managerial career filled with promise, promotions, and devastating conflicts. The man known as Sniffer was a Leeds United legend, a predatory goalscorer who won the 1972 FA Cup with a single strike against Arsenal. But his transition from world-class player to football manager tells a different story, one shaped by 4 players who exposed the gap between elite expectations and lower league realities. Alan Clark became Britain's most expensive player twice in his career. Leicester City paid £150,000 for him in 1968, and Leeds United broke that record with £165,000 just a year later. He was a natural finisher, someone who believed that goal-scoring instinct was a gift you were born with, not something any coach could teach. That philosophy would define his managerial approach and ultimately contribute to his downfall. Clarke's first managerial job came in 1978 when Barnsley appointed him as player manager. He delivered immediate success, leading them to promotion to the third division in May 1999. His reputation as a winner seemed to translate perfectly to management. But then came Leeds United, and with it, the first player who would change everything. When Clarke took over at Leeds United in October 1980, the club was a major institution that had been in the top flight since 1964. Clarke had a budget of £1 million to rebuild the squad, enough for 2 or 3 quality players. Instead, he spent nearly all of it on one man, Peter Barnes. The winger arrived from West Bromwich Albion for £750,000, plus another £180,000 in additional fees. That's £930,000 or 93% of Clarke's entire budget on a single 24-year-old player who was good but not consistently elite. If this was a gamble, Clarke lost spectacularly. Barnes was a natural winger, but Clarke played him as a striker. Deployed in the wrong position, Barnes managed just 1 goal in 16 matches. The pressure mounted quickly. Clarke's assistant manager, Martin Wilkinson, publicly criticised Barnes, saying they wanted to see him get a bit of a sweat occasionally. The club dropped Barnes before the end of the year, worried he might fall asleep on the pitch. Barnes submitted a transfer request and was fined £750 for making negative comments about Leeds in the press. Clarke tried to salvage the situation by offering to swap Barnes for Nottingham Forest's Gary Birtles or Manchester City's Trevor Francis. Both attempts failed. The damage was done. With his entire budget consumed by one underperforming player, Clarke had no resources left to address other weaknesses in the squad. Leeds United were relegated from the First Division at the end of the 1981-82 season, ending an 18-year run in the top flight. Clarke was sacked on June 25, 1982. The Peter Barnes transfer had destroyed his credibility and a historic club's top-flight status in one catastrophic decision. For Barnes himself, the consequences were even more severe. The stress and failure led him to accuse England manager Ron Greenwood of anti-Northern bias. He never played for England again, missing the 1982 World Cup entirely. This wasn't just about one bad transfer. It revealed something fundamental about Clarke's approach to management. When faced with a struggling player, he responded with public criticism and confrontation rather than adaptation or support. After brief success at Scunthorpe United, where he secured promotion from the 4th Division in 1983, only to suffer relegation the following season, Clarke returned to Barnsley in July 1985. This second spell would become his longest tenure, lasting over 4 years and 213 matches. During these years, Clarke faced a different kind of challenge. 2 young players, David Hurst and John Beresford, showed real promise. They were the kind of assets that could have formed the foundation of a competitive team, but Barnsley was located in a town devastated by the collapse of the coal mining industry. The local economy was in crisis, with the region's gross domestic product at just 65% of the national average. The club needed money to survive. Hurst and Beresford were sold out of financial necessity, not tactical choice. Clarke had to watch as the board stripped away his best young talent to generate operating capital. This wasn't the reckless spending of the Leeds era. This was the opposite, enforced frugality that structurally weakened his team year after year. Clarke managed to maintain relative stability for several years, even guiding Barnsley to the 5th round of the FA Cup twice. But continuously selling your best players has only one possible outcome. By late 1989, the team's competitive standard had eroded, results declined, and Barnsley dropped into the relegation places of the 2nd Division. On November 8, 1989, Clarke was sacked. The evidence suggests he was dismissed, not for repeating his financial mistakes from Leeds, but for the unavoidable consequence of managing a team compromised by economic circumstances beyond his control. He had navigated an almost impossible situation for 4 years, but eventually the structural damage caught up with him. Clarke's final attempt at management began on June 4, 1990, when Lincoln City appointed him. He arrived with ambitious plans to implement neat, attractive football at a 4th Division club. The tenure lasted just 179 days and 18 matches. As results started poorly, Clarke's frustration boiled over. He looked at his inherited squad, many of them players with non-league backgrounds, and saw a fundamental problem. In his mind, they simply lacked the natural ability required to play football at the standard he demanded. Clarke made his feelings brutally public. "We are trying to get the players to play football, but there are quite a few players at the club who can't play football. No matter how hard you work with them, they don't come up to the required standard." End of story. He specifically blamed players inherited from his predecessor, Colin Murphy. Graham Bressington and Matt Carmichael were among those criticised. The irony was that analysis of the squad showed these supposedly deficient players were actually regarded as good professionals who served Lincoln City well. Clarke tried to fix the problem by signing Lee Warren to improve the midfield. Warren scored on his debut against Scunthorpe, but played only 2 more matches before being sent back to Bradford. Even Clarke's own recruitment failed immediately. The public criticism destroyed morale. Crowds dwindled to less than 2,500 during the poor run of form. Clarke's inflexible tactical demands and his inability to motivate or develop lower division players had created an untenable situation. On November 30th, 1990, he was dismissed. His managerial career was over. These 4 cases, Peter Barnes, David Hirst, John Beresford, and the Lincoln City squad, reveal 3 distinct problems in Alan Clarke's managerial career. With Peter Barnes, Clarke made a catastrophic strategic error, spending 93% of his budget on one player and then deploying him in the wrong position showed poor judgment and worse resource management. When it failed, Clarke and his staff responded with public blame rather than taking responsibility for the decision. With Hirst and Beresford at Barnsley, Clarke became a victim of external economic forces. The sales were survival measures mandated by a club struggling in a depressed regional economy. Clarke had no control over these decisions, yet he bore the consequences when the inevitable decline in results led to his dismissal. With the Lincoln City players, Clarke experienced a complete psychological breakdown in man management. His conviction that football ability was innate and unteachable meant he had no framework for improving players who lacked elite instincts. Faced with 4th Division talent, he abandoned professional decorum entirely and publicly blamed his players for not being good enough, destroying any remaining authority he had. The pattern across all 3 situations was Clarke's tendency to externalise blame. When things went wrong, it was the players' fault for lack of commitment, the board's fault for selling assets, or the squad's fault for lacking natural ability. What's rarely visible in Clarke's managerial record is evidence of self-reflection or adaptation. Alan Clarke's managerial career spanned 5 tenures across 4 clubs between 1978 and 1990. He secured promotions at Barnsley and Scunthorpe, proving he could inspire short-term success by leveraging his legendary status. But he was sacked at Leeds after relegation, sacked at Barnsley after years of forced asset stripping, and sacked at Lincoln after just 5 months of public conflict. His story illustrates a fundamental truth about the player-to-manager transition. Elite playing ability doesn't automatically translate to effective coaching. Clarke's identity was built on innate, world-class talent. He operated at the highest level of football and believed the most important skills couldn't be taught. That philosophy made him extraordinarily successful as a player, but it left him completely unprepared for the reality of lower league management, where development, patience, and working within severe constraints are essential. The 4 players who defined his managerial struggles, Peter Barnes, David Hirst, John Beresford, and the anonymous Lincoln City squad, weren't really the problem. They were symptoms of a deeper issue, a manager whose high standards and lack of adaptability made him incompatible with the realities of coaching outside the elite level. Clarke's final public statement, "They can't play football," wasn't just about those specific Lincoln City players. It was the culmination of 12 years of frustration, an admission that he couldn't bridge the gap between the world-class football he knew as a player and the developmental resource-constrained reality of lower league management. Today, Alan Clark is 77 years old, remembered fondly as Sniffer the goal scorer, the man who won the FA Cup for Leeds with one perfect strike. His managerial career remains a cautionary tale about the challenges of transitioning from playing to coaching and about what happens when inflexible expectations meet the complex, imperfect reality of building teams with limited resources and developing players who don't possess innate elite ability.
But not as I did as a player at that particular time, you know what I mean?
It's broken out again! It's broken out again, and now this time!
Maybe as the week goes on, we'll be up to some of the time. Up the steps. Walking up the steps was the feeling of...
They called him the wee man, standing at just 5 feet 5 inches tall. But on the pitch, Billy Bremner was anything but small. He was the fiery, relentless heart of Leeds United, a warrior who combined technical brilliance with a ferocious, calculated aggression that defined an entire era of English football. He couldn't rely on height or strength, so he developed something far more dangerous: an unbreakable will and a reputation that preceded him onto every pitch. He remains Leeds United's greatest ever player, a statue commemorating his legacy outside the club's stadium. But beneath the glory lay a trail of bitter feuds, betrayals, and public scandals. This is the story of a man so committed to his craft that his biggest rivals weren't just opponents. They were true antagonists in conflicts that were personal, ideological, and even legal. What happens when a professional conflict becomes so personal that it haunts a player's legacy long after the final whistle? The first great feud was with fellow Scottish international Dave Mackay. Their rivalry was a clash of titans, but in 1966 it became a deeply personal conflict rooted in malice. Mackay, a Tottenham Hotspur legend, was in a vulnerable state, having recently suffered 2 severe leg fractures, and admitted he had concerns about ever playing again. The first break had come in 1963. Then, incredibly, he broke the same leg again in 1964 during his comeback attempt. During a feisty match between Leeds and Spurs, Bremner and Mackay went down near the touchline. When they got up, Mackay claims Bremner didn't just kick him, he deliberately targeted the same leg Mackay had broken twice. This wasn't a clumsy challenge. It was a calculated act intended to inflict maximum damage. In the rough-and-tumble football of the 1960s, hard tackles were expected, but there were lines most players wouldn't cross. Bremner crossed that line without hesitation. Mackay lost it, and the moment was captured in an iconic photograph showing him seizing a quivering Bremner by the neck. Though Mackay hated the photo, it forever defined Bremner's reputation for calculated rather than accidental cruelty. Mackay himself later said, "I could have accepted it if he'd kicked the other one, but he kicked the one I'd broken twice." That single moment became one of the most enduring images of 1960s football aggression. The photograph captured everything people loved and feared about football in that era. Mackay's rage, Bremner's apparent fear, the referee rushing in helplessly. It's been reproduced thousands of times, appearing in books, documentaries, and museums dedicated to the sport's history. Mackay joked that if he had a fiver for every time someone asked him to sign it, he'd be a millionaire. Then came the showdown with Kevin Keegan. This was more than a fight. It was a symbolic clash between the old, controversial Leeds and the new, rising powerhouse of Liverpool. The setting was the 1974 FA Charity Shield, and it was Brian Clough's first game in charge of Leeds United. Clough had already antagonised the team by saying their medals were not won fairly. Bremner, as captain, saw his on-field performance as an act of defiance. He repeatedly scuffled with Kevin Keegan, intent on making his afternoon an absolute misery. Keegan represented everything Bremner opposed. He was young, talented, part of Liverpool's new generation, and on the pitch during Clough's debut, making him the perfect target for Bremner's frustration. Accounts suggest the brawl ignited after Bremner's teammate Johnny Giles hit Keegan. But when Keegan turned around, it was Bremner who was nearest, and a fistfight ensued. In a final act of theatrical fury, both players were dismissed and ripped off their shirts, making the incident front-page news. The image of 2 grown men, England's finest footballers, brawling at Wembley in front of thousands, shocked the nation. This wasn't some obscure match in the lower leagues. This was the Charity Shield, meant to be a celebration of the beautiful game reduced to ugly violence broadcast live. Both players were handed an unprecedented 11-game ban for bringing football into disrepute. For Bremner, the brawl was a public statement, a confirmation that the old Leeds culture reigned supreme, and his suspension crippled Brian Clough's already doomed tenure. The fight wasn't just about two players losing their tempers. It was a battle for the soul of Leeds United, and Bremner made it clear which side he was on. This leads us to Bremner's most significant ideological nemesis, Brian Clough. The mutual hatred between the two men stemmed from Clough's decade-long rivalry with Don Revie. Clough publicly called the Leeds team cheats, and Bremner, as captain, was the physical embodiment of the team Clough despised. Their 44-day war began when Clough told his new squad that their medals were not won fairly. Bremner, alongside teammate John Giles, was seen as hell-bent on destroying the new manager. The Charity Shield fight with Kevin Keegan was the critical catalyst, a public act of defiance against Clough's instructions that removed the heart of the team and accelerated the manager's inevitable departure after just 44 days. Clough wanted to reform Leeds, to clean up their image and their style of play, but Bremner and his teammates had no intention of changing. They'd built an identity under Don Revie, and they weren't about to let an outsider tear it down, no matter how successful he'd been elsewhere. Bremner's biggest battle against institutional authority came in 1975 against the Scottish Football Association. After a match against Denmark, Bremner and 4 other players were involved in an incident at a nightclub. The SFA reacted with extreme severity, imposing a lifetime ban from international football on all 5 players. Bremner felt the incident was exaggerated and used as an excuse to get rid of controversial figures. The details remain murky, but the SFA saw an opportunity to rid themselves of players they considered problematic, players who'd brought controversy and negative publicity alongside their talent and success. The conflict escalated when the SFA attempted to extend the ban to club football, which would have ended Bremner's career. This wasn't just about football anymore. This was about whether a governing body could destroy a man's livelihood without due process. But Bremner fought back, launching a legal challenge that went all the way to the Court of Session. The court ruled that the SFA had acted illegally, overturning the club ban and establishing a significant precedent. Though his international ban generally remained in effect, Bremner had proven that he wouldn't back down, not even when facing the full weight of Scottish football's governing body. He retired from international duty with 54 caps, but he'd made his point. No institution would end his career without a fight. Finally, there's the legal battle with Danny Hegan. While Bremner was comfortable with the Dirty Leeds label for his physical play, he violently defended his honour against accusations of corruption. The conflict began during a crucial match in 1972, when Leeds needed a win to secure the league title. Wolves midfielder Danny Hegan alleged that Bremner approached him during the game and offered him 1,000 lalas to give away a penalty. The accusation was explosive, threatening to destroy everything Bremner had built. Being called dirty was one thing, a badge he wore with pride. But being called a cheat, someone who tried to fix matches, crossed a line that Bremner could never tolerate. Bremner viewed this as an existential threat to his integrity. He denied the claim and immediately sued both Hegan and the newspaper that reported it. The lawsuit was lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining, but Bremner never wavered. Bremner won the lengthy and expensive lawsuit and was awarded a substantial $100,000 in damages, confirming his innocence against the claims of match fixing. This case revealed the line Bremner would never cross. He could be aggressive, controversial, even dirty in the way he played the game, but corrupt? Never, and he'd spend whatever it took, fight however long was necessary, to prove it. The victory wasn't just about money or vindication, it was about protecting his name, his family, and his place in football history. In Bremner's mind, there was honour even in violence, but none whatsoever in corruption. Bremner's career was a series of battles, each one defining a new dimension of his controversial legacy. from the personal vengeance against Dave Mackay and the public defiance of Brian Clough, to the institutional battle with the Scottish FA and the legal defence of his honour against Danny Hegan, his actions were rarely random. They were calculated, purposeful, driven by a fierce commitment to his principles. However controversial those principles might have been. He was the kind of player who would go to extraordinary lengths to protect his team's identity and his own honour. He guided Leeds to multiple titles, proving that his aggression was paired with genuine technical brilliance. His passing was exceptional, his stamina legendary, his football intelligence beyond question. Opponents might have hated playing against him, but they respected his ability. Even Dave Mackay, despite their bitter feud, acknowledged that Bremner was a truly gifted footballer. He was the heart of a team that was both celebrated and condemned, a true reflection of the sport's golden age, when football was more physical, more visceral, more personal than it is today. What made Bremner truly unique wasn't just his willingness to fight, but his understanding of when and how to fight. Against Mackay, it was about establishing physical dominance, sending a message that Leeds wouldn't be intimidated by anyone, not even legendary Hardman. Against Keegan and Clough, it was ideological warfare, a defence of everything Leeds United had become under Don Revie. Against the SFA, it was about standing up to institutional overreach, refusing to let his career be ended by what he saw as a political purge. And against Danny Hegan, it was about drawing a line between being hard and being corrupt, between playing dirty and actually cheating. Billy Bremner died in 1997 at the age of 54. His statue outside Elland Road stands as a permanent tribute to a warrior whose spirit, forged in conflict, remains absolutely revered by those who followed his remarkable career. The statue depicts him with his arms raised, celebrating, frozen in a moment of pure joy. It's a fitting memorial for a man who gave everything to Leeds United, who captained them through their greatest triumphs and their most controversial moments. Fans still visit the statue today, leaving scarves and flowers, touching the bronze for luck before matches. To them, Bremner wasn't a thug or a cheat. He was their hero, their warrior, the soul of their club during its golden era. What do you think was the most intense feud of his career? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of the sport's greatest icons.
I always knew he was a good player. I think I spoke to Sam Allardyce a lot about him, and it was make sure everyone gets an equal opportunity to get into that position.
On the left-hand side, slotting in a talented player, but for me, I kind of want more, particularly who's playing for Man United.
Did Patrick Vieira really call Gary Speed crazy? That's what the headlines want you to believe. But here's the truth. These so-called legends who hated Speed, they didn't hate him at all. In November 2011, the football world stopped. Gary Speed, at just 42 years old, had passed away. The shock was instant. The grief was universal. And in that moment of collective mourning, something remarkable happened. All those supposed rivalries, all that on-pitch aggression, all those fierce battles in the middle of the park suddenly revealed their true nature. They weren't about hate, they were about respect. The deepest kind of professional respect you can earn in football. Speed's death fundamentally changed how we understood his career and his relationships with other players. Because only hours before he died, Speed had been on television, relaxed and joking with former teammates like Gary McAllister and Alan Shearer. Gary Speed was a Premier League legend through and through. He played for 5 clubs during his career: Leeds United, Everton, Newcastle United, Bolton Wanderers, and Sheffield United. At each stop, he was celebrated for one thing above all else: his absolutely ferocious commitment to winning the midfield battle. Speed was the complete box-to-box midfielder, tracking back to defend, driving forward to create. He never stopped running, he never stopped fighting, and he never ever backed down from a challenge. But to understand why Speed's battles were so intense, you need to understand the world he played in. When the Premier League kicked off in 1992, English football was built on traditional strengths, physical power, mental toughness, and direct play. The tactics were simple. Almost every team played the same formation, a rigid 4-4-2, and in that system, the central midfield became the most important battleground on the entire pitch. The priorities were crystal clear. Managers wanted territory and tempo, not fancy passing patterns or patient build-up play. They wanted midfielders who could win the ball through sheer force, then move it forward quickly. The successful players were the ones who embraced physical confrontation as the primary path to victory. High-impact collisions weren't just expected, they were celebrated. This was the environment Gary Speed thrived in, and this is where the story gets really interesting, because being called nasty back then wasn't an insult. It was the highest compliment a midfielder could receive. Roy Keane, arguably the most feared enforcer of his generation, often reflected on his toughest opponents. And when he talked about Gary Speed and David Batty, he used one specific word repeatedly: nasty. Keane said Speed was a tough player to go up against, adding that he was pretty nasty. Batty was nasty too. Now, before we go deeper into these legendary battles, we want to hear from you. Who do you think was Gary Speed's toughest opponent on the pitch? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button so you never miss our deep dives into Premier League history. Understanding what Keane meant by nasty is crucial. In the context of 1990s Premier League football, that label meant you possessed the necessary ruthlessness and resilience to compete at the highest level. It meant you were willing to engage in constant physical battle against Manchester United, the league's most dominant force. This aggressive approach wasn't a character flaw, it was a survival skill. The tactical system itself demanded it. When you're playing box-to-box in a 4-4-2, you're constantly colliding with opposing midfielders in the middle third. You're winning tackles, you're breaking up attacks, you're orchestrating transitions forward. All of it requires maximum physical commitment. Being aggressive wasn't optional, it was essential, and Gary Speed was exceptionally good at it. Speed's long, consistent career meant he was a constant opponent to the dominant forces of Manchester United and Arsenal. This led to repeated, high-intensity battles with their midfield anchors, Roy Keane and Patrick Vieira. The rivalry between Speed and Keane defined central midfield warfare throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. It was rooted in classic club hostility. Manchester United against Leeds United, Manchester United against Newcastle United. These weren't friendly matches. They were wars, and Keane repeatedly confirmed that Speed was elite. He listed Speed among his toughest opponents, placing him alongside Alan Shearer and Patrick Vieira. Roy Keane was saying Gary Speed matched his intensity and quality. This wasn't an opponent, this was a peer. The specific confrontations between them showed just how extreme their duels could get. During a drop ball contest, Keane didn't just win possession, he physically levelled Speed before continuing his run forward. It was a statement of absolute dominance, the kind of moment that defined their relationship. But the competitive intensity didn't stop when the season ended. Keane tells a story about a charity match late in his career. Speed caught him with what Keane called a mistimed tackle, causing a severe ligament injury to Keane's ankle. The injury was so bad that Keane had to leave the pitch after just 8 minutes. His immediate reaction? A promise to see Gary Speed some other day. It was a classic professional threat, rooted in the desire for on-pitch retribution, not personal hatred. Keane later rationalised the injury, acknowledging that if he'd been fully fit, Speed wouldn't have caught him. This reveals something fascinating about their relationship. Keane frequently acknowledged that opponents like Speed and Batty were often the ones initiating contact. He said he was just retaliating over the years. This admission establishes that the aggression was a shared language, a mutual understanding. If Keane accepted that the physical baseline was set by players like Speed, then it validates Speed's approach as not just effective, but mutually respected. The antagonism was directed at opposing tactical objectives. Speed's ferocity was actually the highest form of professional compliment. They weren't enemies, they were warriors who understood each other perfectly. Then there was Patrick Vieira. Speed's teams, particularly Newcastle United between 1998 and 2004, were frequent challengers to Arsenal. This meant numerous high-stakes battles between Speed and Vieira. Both men were physically imposing, powerful midfielders who were central to their team's transitional play. Their confrontations were inevitable. Documentation confirms these direct duels, like Vieira closing down Speed during matches at Highbury. The physical intensity was undeniable, but here's what's revealing. The Speed versus Vieira battles lacked the constant personal drama that characterized the Keane versus Vieira rivalry. That famous feud was often amplified by media coverage, with tunnel confrontations and verbal exchanges captured on camera. Speed and Vieira's conflict remained primarily tactical and professional. The lack of sensational quotes about any personal feud between Speed and Vieira is actually evidence itself. Compared to the abundance of stories about Keane and Vieira's theatrical relationship, the Speed-Vieira dynamic stayed professional. Speed, known for his reserved character and deep humility, wasn't the type to engage in media spectacles. He let his play do the talking. His duels with Vieira remained strictly defined by professional objectives, avoiding the highly personalized conflict that followed other rivalries. This doesn't mean their battles were any less intense on the pitch. It just means they never became personal. So if these legends didn't hate Gary Speed, who were the ones who truly cared for him? The answer lies with his former teammates at Leeds United. The competitive relationships Speed maintained with David Batty and Gary McAllister were fundamentally different from those with Keane and Vieira because they were rooted in shared glory. All three were integral members of the iconic Leeds United midfield that captured the final English First Division Championship in 1992. That title-winning season forged bonds that would prove unbreakable, bonds that transcended any later club rivalry. David Batty was the defensive enforcer of that Leeds team. He shared a remarkably similar competitive temperament with Speed. Remember Roy Keane grouping them together, calling both of them tough and nasty? Both players embraced the aggressive, relentless style that defined successful midfielders in that era. They were forged in the same fire under manager Howard Wilkinson at Leeds. Although Batty and Speed later became opponents as their careers took different paths, the familiarity only intensified the tactical challenge. But crucially, the foundational partnership bond prevailed entirely over any professional antagonism. The most powerful evidence of their enduring friendship came in the aftermath of Speed's death. Batty emerged at Elland Road alongside Gary McAllister and Gordon Strachan in full view of the public to carry and lay wreaths before the commemoration match. This solemn, highly visible demonstration confirmed that the bonds of shared success were supreme. The image of these former champions, united in grief, told the real story, not hate, brotherhood. Gary McAllister served as the disciplined, creative central midfielder and captain for that title-winning Leeds side. He worked closely with Speed during their most defining success. Like Batty, McAllister continued his career at elite clubs, meaning he and Speed faced each other as opponents when McAllister played for Liverpool. But the connection between them extended far beyond professional rivalry into deep personal friendship. McAllister provided one of the most heartbreaking details surrounding Speed's death. He confirmed that he'd been joking with Speed just hours before the tragedy on a televised programme. Hours before Gary Speed died, he was relaxed, laughing, and connected with his old friend. This fact provides absolute proof that any competitive friction from their roles as opponents was completely superficial. McAllister's role in the public tributes was central. He participated alongside Batty and Strachan in the symbolic wreath-carrying ceremony at Elland Road, visibly demonstrating the profound emotional impact of Speed's loss. The collective identity forged during their triumph at Leeds completely superseded any competitive battles they fought later. In professional football, where rivalries create spectacle and drama, these early career bonds maintained absolute emotional supremacy. The contrast between Speed's aggressive competitive profile and his personal character is striking. Despite his reputation as a tenacious, nasty competitor on the pitch, Speed exhibited profound humility about his achievements. He famously cancelled an autobiography project because he didn't think he'd done enough to warrant a book. A Premier League legend who played over 500 league matches didn't think his story was worth telling. This self-effacement suggests that the ferocity seen on the field was a necessary professional mechanism, not a reflection of his gentle, principled character. The analysis of Gary Speed's relationships confirms something important. The premise of hate isn't just inaccurate. It fundamentally misunderstands the professional culture of elite Premier League football during the 90s and early 2000s. The relationships with his primary adversaries, Keane and Vieira, were defined by intense, relentless physical competition, but that competition was a mandatory requirement for survival and success. Keane calling Speed a tough player was professional validation of the highest order. The relationships with his former allies, Batty and McAllister, provided the ultimate counter-narrative. Despite facing each other as opponents later in their careers, the shared history of winning the 1992 title created an unbreakable bond. McAllister being with Speed in his final hours, Batty and McAllister carrying wreaths at Elland Road. These are definitive demonstrations that personal bonds held absolute priority. The immediate outpouring of respect following Speed's death served to instantly recast all professional antagonism into genuine reverence. Gary Speed's enduring legacy is defined not by the intensity of tackles he faced or inflicted, but by the uniform respect he commanded across the entire Premier League landscape. He was a fiercely aggressive, resilient player whose professional conduct was always underpinned by deep, unwavering humility. That's the real story, not hate, respect,